I stood there in the middle of the Grand Solaris Hotel's grand entrance, tugging at the sleeves of my plain blue suit, feeling the fabric rub against my wrists. It wasn't fancy, not like the polished tuxedos and shimmering dresses floating around me, but it was mine, and it was clean. Today was Brielle's wedding, my little girl's big day. I'd spent years pouring everything I had into her, paying for her college tuition, sitting through every dance recital she begged me to watch, listening to her ramble about her worries late into the night. But this wedding? I hadn't picked a single flower or tasted a single cake. That was all the Thompson family, her fiancé's people, dripping with money and class. The marble floors gleamed under my scuffed shoes, and the chandeliers sparkled like they were mocking me. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Then I saw her, Brielle, rushing toward me through the crowd, her white dress trailing behind her like something out of a fairy tale. "Dad, you made it," she said, her voice bright but her smile tight, like it was painted on. I opened my mouth to tell her how beautiful she looked, how proud I was, but she kept going before I could get a word out. "Listen, Mom and I made a few adjustments. You're at the back table. It's just, we didn't want to ruin the photos." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. The back table? I'd pictured myself up front, watching her say her vows, maybe even giving a toast. I'd imagined being part of this, not shoved off to the side like some stranger. I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh, to say it was a joke, but she didn't. Her eyes darted away, and she fidgeted with the lace on her sleeve. I forced a nod, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Sure, Brielle. Whatever you need." My voice came out steady, even though my chest felt like it was caving in. She gave me a quick hug, barely a squeeze, before turning back to the swarm of guests, her veil fluttering as she disappeared into the sea of designer suits and glittering jewelry. I stood there, alone, the noise of the room buzzing in my ears. The back table. Near the kitchen, probably, where the waiters would rush by and no one would notice me. I adjusted my tie, feeling the cheap fabric scratch against my neck. This wasn't how I'd pictured it, not even close. I'd spent years building her up, being there when she needed me, and now I was an afterthought, a smudge they didn't want in their perfect picture. I looked around at the Thompsons' world, everything polished, expensive, and cold. The groom's parents were laughing near the bar, their voices loud and sharp, like they owned the place. Maybe they did. I'd heard Julian's father owned half the real estate in the city, and his mother ran some fancy charity that got her face on magazine covers. And here I was, the guy who'd worked double shifts to keep Brielle in school, standing in a suit I bought off the rack because it was all I could afford after the divorce. Celeste, my ex-wife, had made sure I didn't have much left after that. She'd taken the house, the savings, and most of my pride, leaving me with just enough to keep going. I started walking toward the ballroom, my shoes clicking against the marble, each step heavier than the last. I didn't know where this back table was, but I'd find it. I always found my place, didn't I? Even when it hurt. The air smelled like roses and champagne, and I caught snippets of conversations, people talking about stocks, vacations, things I couldn't relate to. I wondered if Brielle even thought about me when she planned this, or if Celeste had convinced her I didn't belong. Probably the latter. Celeste had a way of twisting things, making me the bad guy, the failure. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. This was Brielle's day, not mine. I'd sit where they wanted me to sit, smile when they wanted me to smile. That's what dads do, right? But as I reached the ballroom doors, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just sadness, it was something harder, sharper. I'd given everything to this family, to my daughter, and they'd stuck me in the corner like I was nothing. I clenched my fists, feeling the tension ripple up my arms. I wasn't going to make a scene, not yet, but I wasn't going to let this slide, either. I'd figure something out. I always did. For now, I'd play along, take my seat at the back, and watch. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. I was still standing near the ballroom doors, trying to shake off the sting of Brielle's words, when I saw her, Celeste, gliding through the crowd like she owned the whole damn hotel. My ex-wife always had a way of making an entrance, and today was no different. She was dressed in some shimmering silver gown that probably cost more than my car, her hair piled up high like a crown, her chin tilted just enough to look down on everyone. She spotted me right away, her eyes narrowing as she made her way over, heels clicking on the marble floor like little explosions. I braced myself, knowing whatever came next wouldn't be good. It never was with her. "There you are," she said, stopping a few feet away, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness she'd perfected over the years. "I was worried you'd show up in your thrift store best." She flicked her gaze over my blue suit, her lips curling into a smile that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I didn't say anything, just stood there, letting her words hang in the air. She'd always loved pointing out what I didn't have, what I couldn't be. Brielle's photographer says we need symmetry, she went on, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist like she was posing for a picture right then. Guest and designer. So, please sit in the back. Her tone was sharp now, all the pretend niceness gone, replaced by that cold edge I'd heard 1,000 times during our marriage. I nodded, keeping my face blank. Got it, I said, my voice low. She didn't even blink, just kept going, like she hadn't already made her point. Near the kitchen, she added, her eyes locking onto mine for a second, daring me to argue. They'll be serving staff meals at that table. Appropriate, right? And with that, she turned on her heel and walked off, her dress swishing behind her, the sound of her shoes fading into the hum of the crowd. I stood there, my heart pounding, not with sadness this time, but with something hotter, something that burned. Appropriate. That word stuck in my throat, bitter and heavy. She'd spent years tearing me down, making me feel small, and now she was doing it in front of everyone, on our daughter's wedding day. I unclenched my fists, not even realizing I'd been squeezing them so hard my knuckles ached. The ballroom was filling up now, people streaming past me, laughing and clinking glasses, oblivious to the little war Celeste had just waged. I could have followed her, said something back, but what was the point? She'd just twisted, make me look like the angry ex, the one who couldn't let go. No, I wasn't going to give her that. I took a deep breath, forcing my shoulders to relax, and started walking toward the back of the room. Near the kitchen, she'd said. Fine. I'd sit there. I'd eat whatever staff meal they shoved in front of me. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As I moved through the crowd, I felt eyes on me, not many, but enough. A couple of the Thompsons' friends glanced my way, their whispers barely hidden behind their hands. That's him, isn't it? The dad, one of them said, her voice low but not low enough. Doesn't look like much. I kept my head up, pretending I didn't hear, but it stung all the same. They didn't know me, didn't know what I'd done for Brielle, what I'd given up. To them, I was just the guy in the cheap suit, the one who didn't fit. And Celeste had made damn sure they saw me that way. I found the table tucked in a corner, just like she'd promised, right by the swinging kitchen doors. The chairs were plain, the tablecloth a little wrinkled, nothing like the fancy setups up front with their floral centerpieces and gold-rimmed plates. I sat down, the wood creaking under me, and watched as waiters rushed by, their trays loaded with food that wouldn't be coming my way. The smell of roasted meat and garlic drifted out from the kitchen, mixing with the perfume and cologne of the guests. I leaned back, crossing my arms, trying to keep my mind steady. I could feel the anger simmering, but I wasn't going to let it boil over, not here, not now. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen for a second, hesitating. I didn't like asking for help, never had. But this wasn't about pride anymore. This was about showing them they couldn't bury me, not like this. I scrolled through my contacts, found the name I needed, and hit call. The line rang once, twice, then a familiar voice picked up. Carlos. It's me. I said, keeping my voice quiet so no one around me could hear. Remember when you said if I ever needed a favor? I need one now. There was a pause on the other end, and I held my breath, waiting. Then he chuckled, low and easy. Consider it done, he said. No questions, no hesitation. I hung up, slipping the phone back into my pocket, and leaned back in my chair. A small smile tugged at my lips. Celeste could shove me to the back all she wanted, but she didn't know what was coming. Not yet. I sat there at that rickety table near the kitchen, the phone still warm in my hand from the call, my heart thumping a little faster than usual. The noise of the wedding buzzed around me, glasses clinking, people laughing, the faint hum of some fancy string music floating through the air. But all I could think about was Carlos's voice on the other end of the line, steady and sure. Consider it done. I didn't tell him much, just that I needed a favor, and he didn't ask. That's the kind of guy he was. Carlos Sanchez, the man who owned the whole Solaris hotel chain, a billionaire who rubbed elbows with presidents and CEOs, and here I was, some guy in a cheap suit, calling him up like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing, not to me and not to him. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under me, and let my mind drift back to how we'd even gotten here. 10 years ago, I'd been a different man, not rich, not flashy, just a guy who knew how to build things. Back then, Carlos was just starting out, a dreamer with big ideas, but no way to make them work. He'd come to me with a problem. His tech platform, the one that would eventually turn him into a household name, was a mess. The code was sloppy, the servers crashed every other day, and he was bleeding money trying to fix it. I wasn't some hotshot programmer with a fancy degree, just a guy who'd taught himself how to make systems hum. But I saw the potential in what he was building, and I spent months, nights, weekends, every spare minute, rewriting the whole backbone of his operation. I didn't ask for much, just a handshake and a thank you. He'd tried to pay me more, but I waved it off. Someday, if I need something, I'll call, I'd told him. And he'd grinned, clapping me on the shoulder. Anytime, my friend. Anytime. Now here I was, cashing in that promise. I didn't feel great about it. Asking for help wasn't my style. I'd spent my whole life figuring things out on my own, scraping by after Celeste took everything in the divorce, keeping my head down while she built her little empire of appearances. But this? Sitting at the back of my own daughter's wedding, watching my ex-wife smirk like she'd won some game I didn't even want to play? It was too much. I wasn't going to shout or throw a fit. That wasn't me. But I wasn't going to let them walk all over me, either. Not today. I glanced around the ballroom, taking it all in. The Thompsons were up front, holding court like royalty, their voices loud and their smiles fake. Brielle was off somewhere, probably fussing with her dress or posing for more of those perfect photos that didn't include me. And Celeste, well, she was flitting around, shaking hands and laughing that sharp laugh of hers, the one that always made me feel like I was the punchline. The kitchen doors swung open behind me, a waiter rushing out with a tray of shrimp or something fancy, and I caught a whiff of butter and herbs. My stomach growled, but I ignored it. I wasn't here for the food. I was here for Brielle, even if she didn't seem to want me around. I tapped my fingers on the table, thinking about what Carlos might do. I hadn't told him specifics, just that I needed a favor, something to shake things up. He didn't know me as Empire, but he owed me enough to make a move. This hotel was his, after all. The Grand Solaris wasn't just some fancy building, it was part of his brand, his legacy. And I'd helped build the tech that kept his whole operation running, from the booking systems to the security cameras. If anyone could turn this day upside down, it was him. I didn't know exactly what he'd pull, but I trusted him. He'd always had a flair for the dramatic, even back when he was just a guy with a laptop and a dream. The thought made me smile, just a little. Celeste thought she had everything under control, her perfect wedding, her perfect daughter, her perfect new life where I didn't fit. But she didn't know about Carlos. She didn't know about the quiet work I'd done, the things I'd built that didn't come with a price tag or a spotlight. She'd always seen me as the loser, the guy who couldn't keep up with her big dreams. And maybe I'd let her think that, kept my head down too long. But not anymore. I wasn't going to let her shove me into the shadows, not on a day that was supposed to mean something to me, too. I shifted in my seat, feeling the cheap fabric of my suit pull tight across my shoulders. The table was empty. No one else had been banished back here yet. Just me, the kitchen noise, and the faint clatter of dishes being washed. I could have gotten up, walked out, left this whole mess behind. But I didn't. Brielle was still my daughter, even if she'd hurt me. And this wedding, her wedding, was still mine to be part of, whether they liked it or not. I'd wait. I'd see what Carlos had in store. And when the time came, I'd stand up, not loud, not angry, just steady. Because that's who I was. The guy who didn't break, even when they tried to push him out. I sat at that back table, the one Celeste had so kindly picked out for me, watching the ballroom hum with life. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and roasted chicken, and the chatter of the guests bounced off the high ceilings like a swarm of bees. Up front, the Thompsons were in their element, Julian's dad slapping backs, his mom flashing that magazine cover smile, both of them soaking up the attention like it was their day instead of Brielle's. I could see my daughter now and then, flitting between tables, her white dress glowing under the chandeliers. She didn't look my way, not once. I leaned back in my chair, though it digging into my spine, and let my hands rest on the table. The cheap tablecloth felt rough under my fingers, a stark contrast to the silk and satin everywhere else. The crowd was a sea of $1,000 suits and dresses that sparkled like they'd been dipped in diamonds. I stuck out. I knew that. My blue suit wasn't much, just something I'd grabbed because it fit and didn't cost me a month's rent. I heard a woman a few tables over mutter something, her voice low but sharp. "That's the dad? The broke one." Her friend laughed, a quick, cutting sound, and I kept my eyes forward, pretending I didn't hear. They weren't wrong about the money part, not entirely. After the divorce, Celeste had taken most of what we'd had, and I'd let her, thinking it'd keep things peaceful for Brielle. But broke? That wasn't the whole story. They didn't know me. None of them did. I smiled to myself, just a small twitch of my lips, because I knew something they didn't. Carlos was out there, somewhere, setting things in motion. I didn't know what he'd do, not exactly, but I could feel it coming, like the air shifting before a storm. I'd asked for a favor, and he'd said yes, no questions. That's what trust looks like, I guess. Years of quiet loyalty paying off in a single phone call. I tapped my foot under the table, restless but calm, waiting for whatever he had up his sleeve. The kitchen doors swung open behind me again, a waiter rushing out with a tray of drinks, and I caught a glimpse of the chaos back there, pots banging, voices shouting orders. It was louder than the fancy chatter out here, more real somehow. Then it started. I didn't notice at first, just a waiter peeling off his jacket and heading for the exit, his tray abandoned on a cart. I figured he was taking a break. But then another one did the same, folding his apron and walking out without a word. I straightened up, my eyes narrowing as I watched. A bartender near the corner started packing up his tools, tossing bottles into a crate like he was done for the night. One by one, the staff began to peel away, quietly, no fuss, just moving toward the doors like they'd all gotten the same signal. The guests didn't catch on right away. A few kept talking, their voices loud and oblivious, but others started to look around, confused. The murmurs grew. "Where's the waiter with the wine?" someone asked, holding up an empty glass. "Did they run out of hors d'oeuvres already?" Another voice chimed in, annoyed. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, watching it unfold. The maitre d', a tall guy in a crisp black suit who'd been barking orders earlier, strode right through the ballroom, his face blank, and pushed out the front doors without a backward glance. That's when the panic started to ripple. A woman in a red dress stood up, craning her neck toward the kitchen. "What's happening?" she said, loud enough that heads turned. The Thompsons stopped mid-conversation, Julian's dad frowning like he'd just bitten into something sour. I didn't move, just sat there, my hands clasped, feeling the weight of it settle in. This was Carlos. It had to be. He'd pulled something big, something I couldn't have dreamed up myself. The room felt different now, like the ground was shifting under everyone's feet, and I was the only one who wasn't surprised. A server near the bar dropped his tray, not loud, just a soft clatter, and walked out, leaving the glasses wobbling on the counter. The buzz of the crowd turned into a hum of worry, voices overlapping as people tried to figure out what was going on. "Is this part of the wedding?" someone asked, half laughing, but no one answered. I glanced toward Celeste. She was still up front, near the head table, her silver dress catching the light as she spun around, looking for someone to yell at. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched into fists. She wasn't in control anymore, and she knew it. That's what made this moment sweet. Not the chaos itself, but the fact that she couldn't stop it. I'd spent years letting her call the shots, letting her paint me as the nobody, the failure. But now? Now she was the one scrambling, and I was just sitting here, waiting to see how far this would go. The kitchen doors stopped swinging, no more waiters, no more trays. The room felt emptier, even with all the guests still packed in. I could hear the Thompsons muttering now, Julian's mom whispering something sharp to her husband. Brielle appeared from the side, her face pale under all that makeup, her eyes darting around like she didn't know what to do. I almost felt bad for her, almost. But this wasn't about ruining her day. This was about me, about taking back something they tried to steal. I smiled again, bigger this time, and settled back in my chair. Whatever came next, I was ready. I sat there at my little corner table, the one Celeste had shoved me to, watching the ballroom turn into a mess of confusion. The staff were gone, waiters, bartenders, even the guy who'd been wiping down tables, all of them had walked out like they'd rehearsed it. The fancy guests in their shiny clothes were starting to squirm, their voices getting louder, sharper, as they waved empty glasses and looked around for someone to blame. I could feel the air getting heavy, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for an explanation. My hands rested on the table, steady, while my heart beat a little faster, not from nerves, but from something else, something like satisfaction. This was Carlos's doing, no doubt about it, and I couldn't wait to see where it went. Celeste's voice cut through the noise like a whip. "What's going on?" she barked, spinning around near the head table, her silver dress flashing under the lights. She was looking for a waiter, a manager, anyone she could snap at, but there was no one left to answer her. Her face was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could tell she was unraveling. She hated not being in charge, always had. I didn't move, didn't say a word, just watched her flail. The Thompsons were on their feet now too, Julian's dad muttering something to his wife, his big shoulders hunched like he was ready to storm the kitchen himself. Brielle stood off to the side, her hands twisting in her veil, her eyes wide and lost. I felt a pang for her. This was her day, after all, but it faded fast. She'd chosen this, chosen them over me. Then the doors swung open, and there he was, Carlos Sanchez, striding in like he owned the place, which, I guess, he did. He wasn't alone. 2 guys in dark suits flanked him, their faces blank but their steps sure, like they were ready for anything. The room went quiet for a split second, everyone turning to look, then the whispers started up again, louder this time. Carlos was a big deal. Anyone who read a newspaper or scrolled a phone knew that. He didn't just run hotels. He built empires, gave speeches at fancy conferences, donated millions to schools and hospitals. And here he was, walking into my daughter's wedding, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me. I sat up a little straighter, feeling the weight of his gaze. "Apologies," he said, his voice smooth and loud enough to carry over the murmurs. "Due to internal policy violations regarding the treatment of one of our partners, we are ceasing service. Effective immediately." He didn't shout, didn't need to. Every word hit like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples through the room. The guests froze, some with glasses halfway to their lips, others clutching their purses like they didn't know what to do next. "Policy violations?" a man near the bar muttered, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" But Carlos wasn't done. He turned slightly, just enough to face Celeste, and then he looked back at me, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Partner." Celeste echoed, her voice sharp and high, cutting through the stunned silence. She took a step forward, her heels clicking, her eyes darting between Carlos and me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. I could see the gears turning in her head, the disbelief creeping in. She didn't get it, not yet, but the rest of the room was starting to. Gasps popped up here and there, little bursts of sound as people leaned closer to each other, whispering. Carlos didn't flinch. He just kept that calm, steady look on his face and said, "This man helped build the architecture that runs my global platform. I owe my empire to him." He nodded at me, and every head in the room turned my way. I didn't move at first, just sat there, letting it sink in. The air felt different now, charged, like everyone was seeing me for the first time. I could hear the Thompsons muttering, Julian's mom clutching her necklace like it might protect her from whatever was happening. Brielle's mouth dropped open, her hands falling limp at her sides. And Celeste, she looked like she'd been slapped, her face going red, then white, then red again. I stood up slowly, brushing my hands down my suit, feeling the cheap fabric under my fingers. All those years of her calling me nothing, a failure, a nobody, and now here was Carlos, telling the world I'd built something bigger than she could ever dream of. The gasps kept coming, champagne glasses hovering in midair as people stared. I didn't say anything, not yet. I didn't need to. Carlos had said enough, and the truth was out there now, hanging over the room like smoke. I'd helped him create the systems that kept his hotels, his apps, his whole damn empire running smooth. No spotlight, no fancy title, just quiet work, the kind I'd always done. And he'd never forgotten it. I caught his eye again, and he gave me a nod, short and sharp, like we were still those 2 guys figuring things out in a cramped office 10 years ago. Celeste took another step, her hand shaking just enough that I could see it. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, but her voice wobbled, and no one was listening to her anymore. The guests were too busy looking at me, some with curiosity, others with something like respect. I didn't care about them, not really. This wasn't about their approval. It was about her, about Brielle, about the life they'd tried to erase me from. I stood there, my shoulders square, feeling taller than I had in years. The walkout was over, but the quake was just beginning, and I was right at the center of it. I stood there, the weight of Carlos's words still settling over the ballroom like a heavy fog, my cheap blue suit suddenly feeling less like a mark of shame and more like a badge I'd earned. The room was a mess of stunned faces. Guests clutching their drinks, whispering to each other, their eyes bouncing between me and Carlos like they couldn't decide who to watch. Celeste was frozen near the head table, her silver dress catching the light, but her face dark with something I hadn't seen in years, panic. She'd built her whole world on control, on making me the nobody, and now that was crumbling right in front of everyone. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, just stood there, letting it sink in, feeling the ground steady under my feet for the first time all day. Carlos was still by the doors, his dark suit sharp against the white walls, his two guys standing like statues behind him. The silence he'd dropped on the room didn't last long. Murmurs started up again, louder now, as people tried to make sense of what he'd said. Built his empire? A guy in a tux muttered, leaning toward his wife. What does that even mean? I could have answered him, could have told them about the late nights, the endless lines of code, the way I'd patched together Carlos's dream when it was just a shaky idea, but I didn't. That wasn't the point. The point was they were looking at me now, really looking, and not as the guy stuck at the back table. I took a step forward, my shoes quiet on the marble floor, and cleared my throat. The wedding can continue, I said, my voice steady, loud enough to carry. If my daughter and her fiancé still want it. But under new terms, new management, and a new seating chart. I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. The room was hanging on every word. I could feel their eyes, their surprise, like I'd just flipped the whole script they'd written for me. Brielle stared at me from across the room, her hands twisting in her veil again. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Julian, her fiancé, stood next to her, his face pale but his jaw tight, like he was trying to figure out if I was a threat or not. Carlos didn't miss a beat. He turned to his guys and said, "Bring in our staff." His voice was calm, like he was ordering coffee, not rewriting a wedding. The doors opened again, and in came a new crew, fresh servers in crisp black uniforms, moving with a quiet confidence that made the old staff look like amateurs. They carried silver trays loaded with food and drinks, their steps quick and sure, like they'd been waiting for this moment. The guests watched, some sitting back down, others still standing, unsure what to do. The air shifted, less chaos now, more curiosity. A woman near me set her glass down, her eyebrows up, like she was watching a show she hadn't bought tickets for. One of the new servers approached my table, the back table, and set down a plate of food that smelled like heaven, roasted meat and herbs, not the staff slop Celeste had promised. He didn't say anything, just nodded at me and moved on. Then another guy came over, young and sharp-eyed, and said, "Sir, your new seat's this way." I followed him, feeling the eyes on me again, past the rows of tables to the front of the room, right up to the head table where Brielle and Julian were supposed to sit. The server pulled out a chair fancy, cushioned, not like the creaky one I'd been stuck in, and I sat down, my hands resting on the smooth tablecloth. It felt strange, being up here, but it felt right, too. Celeste was still standing, her face red now, her hands clenched at her sides. "This is absurd," she hissed, loud enough for the people nearby to hear, but no one jumped to her defense. The Thompsons were watching, too. Julian's dad with his arms crossed, his mom clutching her purse like it might run away. Carlos's team didn't care. Another server approached Celeste, polite but firm, and said, "Ma'am, your seat's over there." He pointed, back toward the kitchen doors, to the table I just left. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, and for a second I thought she'd argue, but she didn't. She marched over, her heels stabbing the floor, and sat down hard, the chair scraping loud enough to make a few heads turn. I looked around the head table. Brielle and Julian weren't sitting yet, still standing off to the side, whispering to each other. The new staff moved like clockwork, setting plates in front of the Thompsons, pouring wine, smoothing out the wrinkles the walkout had left. The guests started to settle, some digging into the food, others still glancing my way, like they were waiting for me to do something else. I didn't. I just sat there, letting the moment breathe, feeling the weight of it. This wasn't about ruining anything. It was about rewriting it, putting me back where I belonged. Not in the shadows, not near the kitchen, but here, at my daughter's wedding, where I'd earned a place. Carlos caught my eye from across the room and gave me another nod, short and simple, before turning to leave. He didn't need to stay, his work was done. The ballroom was alive again, the clatter of forks and glasses picking up, the chatter starting to flow. I picked up my own fork, the metal cool in my hand, and took a bite. It was good, damn good, and for the first time all day, I felt like I could breathe. Celeste could glare all she wanted from her new spot. This wasn't her show anymore. I sat at the head table, the fancy chair firm under me, the plate of food in front of me steaming with flavors I hadn't expected to taste today. Not after Celeste's promise of staff meals and back tables. The ballroom was buzzing again, the new staff moving smooth and quiet, pouring wine and clearing plates like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Carlos had turned it all upside down with one call, one move, and now I was here, up front, where I could see Brielle and Julian whispering off to the side, their faces tight with whatever they were saying. The Thompsons were eating now, though Julian's dad kept glancing my way, his fork hovering like he wasn't sure what to make of me. I didn't care about him. Not really. My eyes were on my daughter. She broke away from Julian after a minute, her white dress swishing as she walked toward me, slow at first, then faster, like she'd made up her mind about something. Her veil was crooked now, her makeup smudged under her eyes where tears had started to gather. She stopped a few feet away, her hands twisting together, and looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "Dad," she started, her voice soft, shaky. "I didn't know. I thought you were just," she trailed off, biting her lip, and I could see the weight of it hitting her. Years of half-truths and lies she'd swallowed whole. "Just what?" I asked, keeping my tone gentle, even though my chest tightened. I set my fork down, giving her my full attention, waiting for her to finish. She took a shaky breath, her eyes dropping to the floor, then back up to me. "Mom always said you were the poor one," she said, almost whispering it. "I thought you didn't care about appearances, about this." She waved a hand at the ballroom, the chandeliers, the fancy crowd. "I thought you didn't want to be part of it." Her words stung, not because they were mean, but because they were honest. That's what Celeste had fed her, year after year, painting me as the guy who didn't measure up, the one who didn't belong. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my hands clasped. "I don't care about appearances," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Never have. But I care about dignity." I let that sit there, watching her face shift, confusion, then something softer, like regret. I didn't build what I built for Carlos to show off. I did it because it mattered, because it helped people. And I didn't raise you to see me as some shadow in the back. My throat tightened, but I pushed through it. "I'm here because you're my daughter, Brielle. That's all that's ever mattered to me." She blinked fast, tears spilling over now, and took a step closer. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I was trying to fit in, to make Mom happy, to make Julian's family happy. I didn't think." She stopped, shaking her head, like she couldn't find the right words. "I didn't push her. I just nodded, letting her work through it, feeling the ache in my chest ease a little. She wasn't a kid anymore, but she was still mine, and I could see her trying to figure out what that meant now." Julian stepped up behind her then, his hands in his pockets, his face serious but not hard. He was a good-looking kid, tall, dark hair, the kind of guy who fit right into this world of money and polish. But he didn't look smug now, not like his parents sometimes did. "Sir," he said, his voice low, respectful. "I apologize. I never meant to disrespect you. I didn't know. None of us did." He glanced at Brielle, then back at me, like he was waiting for me to judge him. I didn't. He wasn't the one who'd put me at the back table. That was Celeste's doing, and maybe Brielle's too, but not his. I looked at him, then at her, and leaned back in my chair. "Today's still yours," I said, my voice calm but firm. "If you want it to be. I'm not here to stop it. But I won't be a ghost at my own child's wedding. Not anymore." I meant it. This wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about being seen, about taking back what they'd tried to take from me. Brielle nodded, wiping her eyes, and Julian put a hand on her shoulder, giving me a small nod back. They didn't say anything else, just turned and walked back to their spot, talking quietly again, figuring out what came next. The room kept moving around me, guests eating, laughing, the new staff keeping everything smooth. I picked up my fork again, took another bite, tasting the richness of it, letting it ground me. Up front, I could see Celeste still sitting by the kitchen doors, her back stiff, her face turned away like she couldn't stand to look at me. Good. Let her sit there. She'd spent years trying to erase me from Brielle's life, from this family, and now she was the one on the outside. I didn't need to yell or point fingers. Carlos had done the heavy lifting, and I'd just stood up when it mattered. A few people started drifting over. Some guy in a suit who said he'd heard of Carlos's platform. A woman who asked if I'd really built it from scratch. I kept my answers short, not bragging, just stating facts. "Yeah, I helped him get it going," I'd say, and they'd nod, impressed, moving on to spread the word. I didn't need their praise. I'd never done it for that. But it felt good, sitting here, knowing Brielle was starting to see me, really see me, not just the shadow her mom had made me out to be. That was enough. I sat at the head table, The noise of the wedding swirling around me like a storm that wouldn't settle. Forks clinking against plates, voices overlapping, the new staff weaving through the crowd with their silver trays. The food in front of me was still warm, the meat tender and the sauce rich, but I wasn't eating much now, just pushing it around with my fork, letting the moment sink in. Brielle and Julian were back at their spots, talking to a few guests, her tears dried and his hand resting on her arm like he was steadying her. The Thompsons were quieter now, picking at their plates, their earlier swagger gone. And Celeste, she was still over by the kitchen, her silver dress a bright spot against the dull corner, her face turned away like she could pretend none of this was happening. I didn't look at her long. She didn't deserve my attention. The room was different now, less tense, more curious. People kept glancing my way, some whispering, others just staring like they were trying to figure me out. I'd gone from the guy at the back to the guy they couldn't stop watching, all because Carlos had opened his mouth and told them the truth. I didn't ask for it, didn't plan it, but here it was, unfolding right in front of me. A man in a dark suit approached my table, his tie loose and his glass of wine half empty. He leaned in, his voice low but eager. "You're the one who built Sanchez's platform?" he asked, like he couldn't quite believe it. I nodded, keeping it simple. "Yeah, I helped him out a while back." He raised his eyebrows, whistled softly, and walked off, already telling the guy next to him what I'd said. Then a woman came over, older, with pearls around her neck and a smile that felt real. "I heard you worked on the back-end systems," she said, sitting down across from me like we were old friends. "My son's in tech. He'd love to hear about this." I shrugged, not sure what to say. It was just work, I told her. Fixed some problems, made it run smooth. That's all. She laughed, like I'd said something funny, and patted my hand before heading back to her table. More people drifted by after that. A business guy who shook my hand too hard. A younger woman who said she'd studied Carlos's company in school. I kept my answers short, not because I didn't want to talk, but because I didn't need to explain myself. The work spoke for itself. I glanced at Celeste again, just for a second. She was sitting stiff as a board, her hands in her lap, her face pale under all that makeup. She wasn't shrinking, not yet, but she was close, and I can see it in the way she wouldn't look at me, wouldn't look at anyone. The world she'd built, all those years of telling everyone I was nothing, was falling apart, and she couldn't stop it. I didn't feel sorry for her, not after everything, but I didn't feel happy either. This wasn't about her, not really. It was about me, about Brielle, about the truth finally getting some air. Then Julian's father came over, moving slow, like he wasn't sure he wanted to be here. He was a big guy, broad shoulders, gray hair, the kind of man who looked like he'd never lost a fight. He stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, and looked me up and down. "I'd heard of a man who built the back-end infrastructure for the UN's health network," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Never imagined he'd be wearing an off-the-rack suit." He paused, like he was waiting for me to defend myself, but I didn't. I just met his eyes, steady, and said, "Character isn't so." He blinked, then nodded, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Fair enough," he said, and walked off, leaving me with that little win. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the cushion press against my back, and took a sip of water. Cool, sharp, grounding. The room kept moving, guests eating, talking, laughing now, the new staff keeping it all together. A senator I vaguely recognized came by next, shaking my hand, and saying something about a mentorship program I'd funded years ago, back when I had a little extra to give. "Didn't know that was you," he said, clapping my shoulder. "Good work." I nodded, thanked him, and let him go. It was strange, all these people suddenly seeing me, but it wasn't why I'd done any of it. Not the coding, not the helping, none of it. I just wanted to build something solid, something that lasted. Brielle was watching me now. I could feel it. She was still with Julian, but her eyes kept flicking my way, like she was piecing me together all over again. I didn't wave her over, didn't need to. She'd come when she was ready. For now, I just sat there, letting the unveiling happen, letting the room rewrite me from the broke dad in the cheap suit to the guy who'd built something real. It wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt like I fit, not because of where I was sitting, but because of who I was. The food was cold now, but I didn't care. I'd want something bigger than a meal. I sat at the head table, the noise of the wedding settling into a steady hum around me. Glasses clinking, voices blending, the new staff moving like shadows to keep everything smooth. The plate in front of me was mostly empty now, just a few scraps of meat and a smear of sauce left, but I wasn't hungry anymore. The air felt lighter, like the tension from earlier had burned off, leaving something softer in its place. The lights dimmed a little, and the music shifted, strings fading out, replaced by a slow, warm beat that meant the dancing was about to start. I leaned back in my chair, watching as Julian led Brielle to the center of the room, her white dress glowing under the chandeliers, his hand steady on hers. The first dance, hers and his, the moment everyone had been waiting for. I didn't move, just watched them sway together, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. They looked good, happy, even, and for a minute I let myself feel that old ache, the one that came from knowing she wasn't my little girl anymore. She was theirs now, his, the Thompsons, this whole shiny world I'd never fit into. But then she glanced my way, just a quick look over Julian's shoulder, and I saw something in her eyes, something soft, something sorry. I didn't smile, didn't wave, just held her gaze until she turned back to him. She'd come to me when she was ready. I knew that now. The song ended, and the crowd clapped, polite at first, then louder, a few whistles cutting through. Julian kissed her forehead, and they stepped apart, letting other couples filter onto the floor. I stayed where I was, my hands resting on the table, feeling the smooth wood under my fingers. The room was alive again. Laughter, chatter, the rustle of dresses as people moved. I could see Celeste out of the corner of my eye, still by the kitchen, her silver dress catching the light, but her face dark, closed off. She hadn't moved much since they'd sat her there, and I didn't care to check if she was watching. This wasn't about her anymore. Then Brielle was there, walking toward me again, her steps quick and sure this time. She stopped in front of my chair, her hands clasped tight, her veil pushed back so I could see her face clear. Red eyes, smudged makeup, but steady now. "Dad," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm sorry for everything. I was trying to fit into their world, Mom's world, Julian's family. I forgot who raised me." She swallowed hard, her fingers twisting together, and I could see how much it cost her to say it. I didn't answer right away, just looked at her, letting her words hang there, feeling them settle into me like stones dropping into deep water. I pushed my chair back a little, standing up slow, my suit pulling tight across my shoulders. "You don't have to explain," I said, keeping my voice low, just for her. "I get it. You were caught up in it. All this." I nodded toward the room, the chandeliers, the fancy crowd spinning around us. "But I'm still here, Brielle. I've always been here." She blinked fast, tears welling up again, but she didn't let them fall this time. Instead, she stepped closer and reached for my hand, her fingers cold but firm against mine. I squeezed back, not hard, just enough to let her know I meant it. "I didn't see you," she said, almost a whisper. "Not really. Mom made it sound like you didn't care, like you were just gone. But you're not. You never were." Her voice cracked, and she shook her head, like she was mad at herself for believing it. I didn't say anything about Celeste, didn't need to. Brielle was figuring it out on her own, and that was enough. I let go of her hand and nodded, just once, telling her it was okay without words. She didn't need me to yell or point fingers. She just needed me to be here, steady, like always. The music picked up again, faster now, and more people crowded the dance floor. Julian's parents, some cousins, a few drunk uncles stumbling through the steps. Brielle stayed with me, though, hovering close, like she wasn't ready to go back yet. Then Carlos appeared, weaving through the crowd with that easy stride of his, a glass of something dark in his hand. He stopped a few feet away, raised it toward me, and said, "To the man who chose silence over ego, and dignity over display, you showed us all what true power looks like." His voice carried, not loud but clear, and a few heads turned. Guests, staff, even Julian's mom, who looked like she'd just swallowed a lemon. The room clapped, some hesitant, some strong, and Carlos grinned, taking a sip before disappearing back into the crowd. I didn't say anything, just sat back down, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. Brielle sat too, pulling a chair close, and for a while we just watched, her beside me, quiet, her hand resting near mine on the table. The dancing went on, the lights spinning, the night stretching out. I didn't need to do more. I'd said what I needed to, stood where I needed to. This was her day, still, but it was mine too, in a way I hadn't expected. And that was the truth of it, laid bare on the dance floor, no shouting required. I woke up the next morning in my small apartment, the sun sneaking through the blinds and hitting my face, pulling me out of a sleep that hadn't been deep but had been enough. The bed creaked under me as I shifted. My blue suit crumpled in a heap on the chair where I'd tossed it last night. The wedding felt like a dream now, fuzzy around the edges but sharp in the middle. Every moment burned into my head. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the ache in my shoulders from sitting so long, from standing so tall when it mattered. The clock on the nightstand said it was just past 8, and the quiet was a relief after all the noise of the Grand Solaris, the clinking glasses, the chatter, the music that wouldn't stop. I lay there for a minute, staring at the ceiling, letting it all settle. Then my phone buzzed on the table, a short, sharp sound that made me sit up. I reached for it, squinting at the screen, and saw a message from Carlos. "Staff are still talking about you. You're a legend." I read it twice, letting the words sink in, and a smile crept onto my face, not big, just enough to feel real. A legend. Me, the guy in the cheap suit, the one Celeste had shoved to the back, the one Brielle hadn't seen until it was almost too late. I set the phone down and leaned back against the headboard, my hands resting on my knees. It wasn't about the staff talking, not really. It was about what it meant, that I'd stood up, quiet but sure, and they'd noticed. I got out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wood floor, and shuffled to the kitchen to make coffee. The machine hissed and gurgled as it worked, filling the room with that familiar smell, grounding me. I thought about last night, Brielle sitting next to me after the dance, her hand close to mine, her words soft but heavy with everything she'd held back for years. She'd seen me, finally, not as the shadow her mom had painted, but as the guy who'd raised her, who'd built something worth seeing. Julian had nodded at me before they left, a quiet respect in his eyes, and even the Thompsons had kept their distance, their usual loudness dialed down. It wasn't a big win, not the kind you'd see in a movie, just a shift, a crack in the wall they'd built around me. The coffee was ready, and I poured it into a chipped mug, the heat warming my hands as I stood by the window, looking out at the street below. It was empty, just a few cars parked along the curb, the world still waking up. I took a sip, the bitterness sharp on my tongue, and let my mind drift back to the moment Carlos had raised that glass. "Dignity over display," he'd said, and it stuck with me, rolling around in my head like a stone I couldn't put down. I'd never been loud, never needed to be. I'd built things, fixed things, kept going when Celeste took everything and left me with scraps. And last night, I hadn't shouted or thrown a punch. I just made a call, stood my ground, and let the truth do the rest. I didn't care about embarrassing Celeste, though I knew she'd felt it, sitting there by the kitchen doors, her perfect world cracking. That wasn't why I'd done it. And it wasn't about revenge, not the kind that leaves you empty after. It was about stepping into the light, after years of letting them push me into the dark. Labels like less than, simple, just the ex-husband sticking to me like mud. I'd carried that weight too long, kept my head down, thinking it was better for Brielle if I didn't fight back. But last night, I'd shed it, piece by piece, until I was just me again, raw, real, standing where I belonged. My phone buzzed again, and I walked back to the nightstand, setting the mug down. It was Brielle this time. "Dad, thank you. For everything. Can we talk soon?" I stared at it, my chest tightening, not with hurt, but with something warm, something I hadn't felt in a while. I typed back, "Anytime, kid. I'm here." I hit send and set the phone down, feeling lighter than I had in years. She wasn't gone, not to me, not anymore. We'd figure it out, one step at a time, and that was enough. I finished my coffee, the mug empty now, and rinsed it in the sink, the water cold against my fingers. The day stretched out ahead, nothing big planned, just a quiet Saturday, maybe a walk, maybe some work on the old laptop I still tinkered with. But it felt different, like I'd turned a corner I didn't know I'd been heading for. I wasn't a legend because people said so. I was a legend because I'd chosen to be, in my own way, without shouting or begging for it. One quiet call, like Carlos had said, and the world had listened, not because I demanded it, but because I'd earned it. I grabbed my jacket, not the suit, just an old one that fit, and stepped outside, the air crisp and clean. The street was waking up now, a dog barking somewhere, a car starting down the block. I walked, hands in my pockets, feeling the ground solid under my feet. This was my life, simple, steady mine. And after last night, no one could take that from me again.